listening to Pharmacy, IT, and Me, your Informatics Pharmacist podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Pharmacy, IT, and Me podcast. I'm your host, Tony Dow, and joining me today is Nicole Salata, who is a clinical informatics pharmacist. I'm really excited to speak with Nicole today because she has a very interesting and unique path that she got into the field. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Hey, Tony. I am great. And thank you so much for having me and giving me the opportunity to tell my story.
Awesome. So just before, we get into some of the details about, your career path and things like that, can you tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Nicole Salata. I have my Doctor of Pharmacy degree from University of Illinois, Chicago. I have my master's degree in informatics from UIC as well. I have an MBA from Quantic, and I've been a pharmacist for about 13 years. I've had about 18 years in the pharmaceutical industry, which includes time as a technician and intern. On a personal note, my husband and I are both foodies, and I'm an avid gardener and reader, and I love what I do as an informaticist.
Awesome. When you said you love what you do as an informaticist, I don't think I've spoken to anybody as of yet that has not liked what they did for informatics. Is that right? Do you know anybody that just, I don't know, like just really dislikes it? Because I have not met anyone like that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I don't think I've ever met anyone who doesn't love it either. But I also know that there are several personality traits or characteristics that we all seem to have that kind of explains why we like what we do.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've noticed that too. Yeah, I think even just our career paths, like both you and I, we went through like some sort of like postgraduate training on informatics. And then we also went through an MBA program too. So
Yeah.
there's some similarities. But, talking about education, I did notice is kind of interesting. We kind of talked about it before the recording, but, you started off in undergrad and what you eventually finished in undergrad was a bachelor's in Spanish. And then you went to pharmacy school. So how did that kind of come about between, from Spanish going into like, you want to be a pharmacist?
So to be fair, before we go to Spanish, I actually got accepted into undergrad as a chemical engineering major. So the love for math and science was always there, and the aptitude for it as well was always there. And through a series of, I don't know if you want to call them misadventures or whatever, I changed my major 4 times in undergrad. I had a lot of college credit coming in, so I had the luxury of being able to change my mind. And I ended up with a bachelor's degree in Spanish, but part of the driving factor for that was, I guess, maybe an internal understanding that population dynamics were changing. And no matter what I decided to do with my life, being able to speak a second language and be confident in it, particularly Spanish, which so much of the world speaks, was always going to be an advantage. And so while it may not be the most marketable degree as just a skill, as an add-on skill, it plays a huge role in my career development and how I got into informatics.
Yeah, I don't know how it is in your area, but like where I'm at, like I went to school in LA and I'm in OC right now. But in LA, I remember during pharmacy school, there was always a huge need for Spanish speaking pharmacists. And then like for the students who became interns at those clinics, they ended up learning medical Spanish as well. So it was like, at least in our area in LA, it was a huge need. And I didn't know a lot of Spanish, but the little I know, like it did help too, like with the communication and education with those kind of patients.
And the trust, like as soon as they catch on to like the entire Hispanic community, especially the ones that struggle with English and are more comfortable, like just interacting in Spanish, the trust that you get when you can speak to them in their language, it changes the entire dynamic of every single visit they have to the pharmacy. I had patients. So right after I graduated pharmacy school, the market in Chicago and Illinois was completely saturated. So I actually relocated halfway across the country to Fresno, California, a place that is chronically short of pharmacists because there's not a pharmacy school close by. And my first 3 years as a pharmacist were spent working with migrant communities, particularly the ones that worked in the orchards and the fields around the ag there. And my patients, the town that I practiced in first was Visalia, and the second town that I practiced in was Dinuba. which are both a little bit south of Fresno, a little bit north of Bakersfield. The rapport that I had with the communities that I worked with, simply because I could fluently converse in Spanish, even if I didn't have the medical vocabulary at first, because I didn't, but it built over time. Just being able to ask them questions in Spanish and understand cultural references and then build those cultural references into how to explain things to them. I had the most loyal following of patients who literally followed me from one town to another when they found out I was moving, just because finding anyone who could speak it and then would listen to you and hear what you were saying was not something they were used to in healthcare. So I had a lot of success early in my career as a pharmacist simply because of that Spanish.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Just seeing like how it affected the LA area and then
Yeah.
how like, Spanish speaking pharmacists were so valued. And that report thing, I didn't think about it, but thinking back about it now, it is very true. I mean, like, so for me, like I speak Vietnamese, and whenever like I was an intern
Mhm.
at a retail pharmacy and a Vietnamese patient was there, and they were struggling to communicate in English what they
Mhm.
needed, but once they knew that I spoke Vietnamese, suddenly like this whole wall in front of them just disappears, and it just became like a very different rapport of like, trust and comfortability of just speaking.
Yeah.
But
And
yeah,
then once you have that trust, the things that you can get out of them, the things that they tell you that they haven't told anybody else, and all of a sudden things start making sense, like why this isn't working or why their health condition is not getting better despite the fact that they're on all the right meds and all the right doses. I had one elderly Hispanic patient who was on two different types of insulin and three anti-diabetic drugs, and her blood sugar was still in the 300s every morning. And I asked her what she ate for breakfast. And she was like, "Oh, well, I have rice, beans, and tortillas for breakfast." And nobody had ever asked her that. So nobody knew that her entire breakfast was carbs and could never explain to her that she needed to change that in order to have an impact. So 3 months after we had that conversation, we had her off of one insulin and one anti-diabetic drug. Just 3 months.
wow, yeah, yeah. I mean the whole part of like communication too, like just
Yeah.
being able to communicate is like a very basic thing that will improve all of that. So, but yeah, and then like when you went through pharmacy school, after you started pharmacy school and you went through pharmacy school, then you worked in the retail setting for a while. Like, was informatics something that you knew during school you wanted to get into, or did you kind of learn about that later?
So I kind of fell into informatics. When you do something for long enough, you start to, and like you get really comfortable with what you do and what you know, you start to notice patterns. So I'm pretty sure that most pharmacists who worked in hospital can speak to this in hospital environments, especially if you have a specific specialty, or retail pharmacists, you notice patterns. And I was seeing them, but I didn't have access to any data. So I could never validate or even explore what I thought I was seeing, because it was literally just me saying, "Hey, this seems like I've seen this before in another patient," or "I swear this patient or this subset of patients is always coming in with this problem in this time frame related to something else." And at first I thought the answer was public health. So I actually enrolled in a public health master's program and I hated it. Not that I hate public health, I actually love public health, but the program was just not the right fit for me. And so I did some more research and kind of stumbled into informatics. And it took me another year and a half, 2 years to enroll in the informatics program. But once I did, it was like coming home. It was like all the things that I had questions about, I was finally learning how to get answers to.
So when did you kind of like feel that it was comfortable? Like I know that you went through the program, but was there a moment in the program where you felt like, oh, this is it. This is what I've been looking for? Or was it kind of like gradual?
I don't even know that I really felt it when I was in the program, like that comfort level. I loved what I was learning and I felt like everything I was learning was important. But when I was doing my degree in informatics, and even prior to that, like informatics was really only a field that applied to hospitals and health systems. And I didn't come from that part of pharmacy practice. I came from retail. So I didn't have any opportunity to apply what I was learning. There was no like cross referencing and applicability to things that I'd seen or things that colleagues of mine had seen, because it wasn't within the same realm of practice and, knowledge and experience. So I don't think I ever really felt comfortable until I was, 4 months into my first informatics role. And I was like, I know how to do all this. This is amazing.
So, when you were in that role, what was the You talked to me about this before, but not on the podcast, of course. But
Yeah.
your role over at PharmD Live, like that was a very interesting story about like getting that role to begin with. So from what we spoke about before, you initially weren't interviewing for informatics role, right?
Right. And so like it's a thing that I bring up a lot. We all talk about how we were lucky or we were in the right place at the right time. And I mean, that's definitely part of it. But the reason that we were lucky is because we did the work and we had the background going in. And so in this case, part of my luck came from my degree in Spanish because the position I was applying for was a telehealth pharmacist that was Spanish speaking. And I applied off of Indeed. This one I didn't get off of LinkedIn, but I applied for it. And my director of pharmacy happened to be an amazing guy who we were just talking during the interview. It was a great interview. And I was able to bring in my interest and love for informatics. And he started telling me about what PharmD Live was doing, how they were building their own platform, asking me if I'd be okay interviewing with the COO, CTO on the next interview. And at that point, I got super nervous, but of course, I didn't tell him that. And instead of taking the Spanish speaking pharmacist position, I was actually offered a role as a clinical pharmacist informaticist. And that is how I kind of talked my way into my first informatics role. Didn't technically exist yet.
Yeah, it's really cool to hear that, and it's also interesting during like these times of like that role of like a pharmacy informaticist. It's definitely expanded like in the last decade or so, but for some reason it just still feels like not everyone knows exactly what an informaticist does as a pharmacy informaticist, right?
Yeah.
And this role that you had, even though it's a clinical informaticist, even though working for PharmD Live, can you kind of describe what you did and how this may have differed of like what someone thinks a traditional quote unquote traditional pharmacy informaticist does?
Yeah. So in my, I don't know if I want to call it naivete, but that's probably the best way to put it. My understanding of what an informaticist did before I got that role was someone who built pharmacy-based order sets and helped, improve clinical decision support systems and worked in that aspect specifically related to drugs, like how drugs are used in the system, how they travel through the system, how they're ordered, everything. And I thought that was it. And then my first role, my role at PharmD Live was nothing like that. So I have no computer science, no software engineering background at all, aside from like one class in undergrad, which technically doesn't count. And then anything that I happened to learn during my master's in informatics, which is not dedicated to any of those things. When I came on, they still didn't have their own software platform, which they were building from scratch, ready to go. And they had clients that had already signed. So I actually spent the first couple of months figuring out where they were in the project, figuring out where the disconnects were, figuring out who the stakeholders were that were in charge of those disconnects, and then finding places for us to come together and get out an MVP. So I literally helped us get to MVP, which is something I never thought I would do. And then because I understood the system inside and out from all of those conversations, and I was our only informaticist, I was the one who was designing, gathering requirements, building out, specking out any upgrades to the system. Cause we're talking basic, like one level of sign on. Now they were using a different platform for their telehealth calls. It was not integrated. So you have to have multiple things open on a screen or multiple screens. It was less than ideal. So I had to design all of these features based on what I understood was our architecture and where there was flexibility and where there wasn't flexibility. And then once I had this together, I had to put together PowerPoint presentations. Sorry, I just dated myself, slide decks for offshore development teams and pitch these things to these teams and then sit in on the meetings with them when they're showing me wireframes and different UI UX designs and trying to understand where to pull data from in order to build those features. And then taking that back to the pharmacists saying, here's how this looks like it's going to work. What do you think? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What would you change? What do you want to keep? And back and forth and back and forth. Meanwhile, I'm still a clinical pharmacist, informaticist. So I'm doing clinical work. I was the only one who understood revenue cycle management enough to be able to do our billing. So I was creating all of our billing and invoicing and sending it off to finance to polish up. I was training every single department in the company on how our billing structure worked so that they knew what's going on. I was doing writing and editing for marketing. Like it was a startup, so I was doing everything.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like the whole startup mentality, like you learn so much because you're in a situation where you have to kind of learn so much, right? Because
Yep.
there's no, yeah, like it just feels like you're coming in like, oh shoot, there's a lot of things I need to do. And then because you have to, then you just learn it. So I guess my question is like, there are things that you may, you do have experience in, but there are things that you may not have had done before, but then
Mhm.
now you're suddenly in that situation where you have to manage it. How did you kind of get yourself ready for that? Or how did you handle those kind of things?
It's one of those things where you have to learn how to not be afraid to fail, and then you have to not be afraid to fail spectacularly. And thankfully, I never failed spectacularly, but I definitely sat in on a few meetings where I was presenting information and I had zero idea of whether or not I went in the right direction or understood the assignment or gave them a deliverable remotely close to what they were expecting because I didn't know how to ask the questions. I didn't know how to find out what I didn't know or what they didn't know or what they actually really needed to solve as the problem versus the solution they presented. And so you can't be afraid to be wrong. And that's a hard lesson for a lot of people, myself included.
Yeah, I think like that's a big barrier too. Like I think like I agree with you how difficult it is because like when we go to school, it feels like it's the school system, is set up to be like you cannot fail, right? You should not fail.
Hmm.
You cannot fail. And then when you're in the real world, it becomes like, something difficult to overcome but and accept that, you should be not afraid to because that's how you learn, right?
Yep. And I was lucky too, both at PharmD Live and now at my current role in Teladoc. I've had amazing bosses who were patient and were kind and who set the bar higher than what I thought I could do and pushed me to get there. But again, they did it with patience and they gave me feedback, which was not always positive, but they gave it to me in a way where I could actually receive it and act upon it instead of like berating me or yelling at me or belittling me. Because I think we've all worked with at least one of those bosses before, and none of the bosses I've had in informatics, thank goodness, were those bosses.
Yeah, I've noticed that too with like different bosses I've had in informatics. It's always been about like improving and it's not so much like the punishment or the berating part. And I don't know if that's like just an informatics trait, but I do feel like a lot of cohesiveness and teamwork within this field.
Yeah, and I definitely have noticed the same thing, and I almost wonder if it's because this is one of those areas where there's always more work than you have people to do it. Simply because I don't think that the field is well understood by anyone who's not in it, and trying to prove how much work it is when you're in it can be really difficult sometimes. So we all know that we will get farther together if we go there together, and leaving people behind is just going to end up dumping more work on your plate at the end of the day. So it's kind of really in everyone's best interest for everyone to know as much as they can.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like a dynamic that I didn't realize until like right now when we were just talking about it. So, but yeah, like your rollover at PharmD Live sounded like it was just a crash course in everything. Like I heard you say you were doing like you're running Scrum and you were like doing project management, all that stuff, and also rev cycle. I mean, over where I work, we have a whole department just handling rev cycle, and it's so crazy to hear that you did that for PharmD Live. But
Yeah.
yeah, so now that you're over at Teladoc, I think your title now is like a clinical informatics and analytics pharmacist. So what does that role entail for you now?
Oh my gosh. I'm still figuring that out. We're all still figuring that out because my role is new. But Teladoc they're a company that's been put together through a lot of other smaller acquisitions over time, and they've had a lot of acquisitions recently. And they're also branching out into new fields. For anyone who's not familiar, Teladoc really made it onto the map as kind of a telehealth urgent care type setting. And they've expanded their offerings significantly. And in addition to that urgent care, which they still do offer, they also have mental health lines, they have a dermatology line, and they have a primary care line as well. And part of what the process has been is moving to a different EMR because their urgent care, their original EMR was built in-house. And I've noticed that a lot of companies that start out building in-house always reach a point where they have to decide whether it's worth it to keep investing in that or to buy something better. And Teladoc made the decision to buy something better and start transitioning over to that. And it's a huge process. And so my role in a nutshell is I am responsible for the digital manifestation of our formulary. There are other people who decide what's on formulary and what's not on formulary. I'm certainly part of those conversations and always subject matter experts that can be consulted if they have questions. But my role is to make sure that what's available to be prescribed is correct. And that right now we're at that really basic level, but there already is planning going into place on how we can start implementing clinical decision support to try and drive different metrics like improving generic prescribing, where we can start keeping track of, how many of our diabetic patients are on insulins and how many are on GLP-1s and how many are on metformin and what did their outcomes look like. And we have these vast amounts of data. I work on a team. I'm the only pharmacist on my team. My boss is a physician. And then I have an informaticist and then some amazing data people. I don't even fully know their titles. I'm really sorry, guys. But they make everything come together. And then we have a person who came over from like marketing project management who helps us take the information we have and craft a message that the company can use or the company can understand and the greater public can understand. But I'm really excited to start being able to dive into that data in addition to helping on the back end, which again is weird for me because even at PharmD Live, I wasn't really in the back end. And so now I'm learning SQL and I'm learning how to write queries and I'm like up to my eyeballs in the Multum database, learning what everything means and how everything's connected. But it's for someone who's in a role that didn't challenge them for a long time in retail, where everything was the status quo and it's just about surviving, it's so invigorating and uplifting. And just, I don't dread going to work on Monday. I look forward to it because I have no idea what I'm going to learn that day. So
Yeah, it's a like it's a really cool feeling because like I feel the same way. Like every day I know it's gonna be different. Every day it's like, yeah, sure, there's this general structure of like what things are gonna come in, but there's just so many new things to learn every day and it's never boring. Like there's always something new in this field. Like even though it may be similar, there's general similarities, but there's still something that you learn that's just new every day. And I know you're at Teladoc and they're doing a big change on that. I'm at a health system and we already are established in the EHR that we're using,
mhm.
but things still change. New workflows come in, new guidelines come in, requires us to do a lot of creative thinking, and
Yep.
it's just fun. I don't know how else to explain it.
And that's the other thing too. So we're both talking about being excited about the things that we don't already know and are going to learn. And one of the things that I've noticed about informaticists is they're chronically curious and they love learning and they're not afraid to not know the answer. Because at the end of the day, I don't even know how many questions I get asked during the day where I'm like, I don't know that, but I want to. And so I'm going to find out. As opposed to, I don't know, but I need to get back to you with an answer like we're taught in pharmacy school. No, I want to know the answer to that. I want to understand that. So yeah,
Yeah,
I love
yeah.
that
I
part.
think I think that's like one of the things like in our field is just like the type of people in the field are the ones that are super excited about like just being challenged in these. I think like the other thing is solving puzzles, right? Like it just feels
Yes.
like you're solving a problem all the time.
Yes. Yeah. Creative problem solving is a huge part of it. And there's definitely an underlying ability to have strong logic skills there. But sometimes those logical leaps you have to make, so I read the book. This is totally going off topic, but it kind of explains the point. I read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks about how someone needs 10,000 hours of practice to be an expert in a field. And I was like, yeah, this totally makes sense. And then I was listening to his podcast, which was The Next Big Idea or something like that. And they covered a book. I'm blanking on the name of it, but it was about the idea of being a generalist. That was like the first episode they did in the podcast, maybe the second one. And he talks about how the people who have been the most innovative in any field and most successful in any field are not the people who focused all of their time on being an expert in one thing. It's the ones who have jumped from thing to thing and have a substantial amount of knowledge in multiple things, but are not an expert really in almost anything. And if there's anything that I've learned from my career between my Spanish and my retail background and now my informatics, all of those things are essential to me being successful in my current role. Like I couldn't do my role without them. But at the same time, you would never see a job description that says you need this background to have this job. So part of what's so cool about what we do is there are so many ways you can come into it and be successful, but it's really hard to plan out the ideal career to get into informatics.
Yeah, nah, that's a really good point. Like, was it some kind of quote out there that are I'm butchering it. It's something about like our experiences are the sum of like who we are today. Something like that, right?
Yes.
And yeah, and that whole thing about like it's just so difficult. Like people do ask me that too. Like, what do I need to do to become a good candidate to be a pharmacy informatics person? There's things I can suggest, and I'm gonna probably ask you the same thing in a bit, but it's like it's very difficult to tell you exactly what it is because everyone's experiences will be different and you may have an experience already that's going to contribute to you being a good informatics pharmacist that you don't know yet until you are the informatics pharmacist. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that sometimes when people ask me like how would you answer it?
Oh, I get that question all the time, especially now that I've started being more active on LinkedIn and talking about background and experience and everything. And I mean, you're 100% right. Like, there is no follow this checklist or if you do all of these things, because personality plays a role. So, if you're not interested in coding, you can still be an informaticist because there are informaticist roles that don't code. If you don't like I don't know, if you don't like writing research papers, you can still be an informaticist because there are informaticist roles where you're not going to have to participate in research projects and do all those things. If you're one of those people who always hated having to look up every detail about a drug and remembering it and counseling a patient on it, you don't have to do those things in some informatics roles. In others, you have to be able to know those down pat when you're building clinical decision support or whatever. But there is no template for a clinical informatics pharmacist or even a clinical informaticist. So because there's no template, it's really hard to say that these are the skills you need. I think what I've found, especially in the other roles that I've interviewed for, there are some that are looking for people who are highly technical in a specific area. Like anytime you're looking at a role that wants you to be Epic certified, you have to be Epic certified. And that's really all they care about. Everything else, they'll teach you versus other roles where they're looking at someone who has a certain set of qualities, which are evident in the things that they're learning or the way that they approach problems or the skill sets that they're building on their own outside of a role that show an inclination towards being a good informaticist. And then the companies are willing to shepherd them that way. So I think more than to kind of finally get to the answer to the question, more than being able to recommend a certain set of skills or abilities as an informaticist, it's almost more like there's a certain set of qualities you need to have. And if you have those qualities and you just are true to them and you use them to explore and learn and be creative and challenge yourself and again, not be afraid to be wrong, then if the role is what you really want, you'll find one.
Well said. I couldn't have said it better.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's always a very challenging question to answer. I
It
always feel
is.
bad because like I will have an answer, but then sometimes like my answer is like, well, there's caveats to it. So yeah, it's one of those things too. Like, I mean, those of you out there who are interested in the field or want to learn more, like you want to like try to get into the field, speak with multiple people. Everyone has a slightly different advice because everyone slightly has a different path. So I think that's a good thing to kind of like to do your research and like interviewing as many people as possible too, to kind of like see where each person, because like the field itself, the roles out there, they're all different in a way. Like you said earlier, right?
Mhm.
One role might be more like clinical inclined while another one's more technical inclined. So a lot of that also like determines of like what kind of person will go into those roles. But yeah, but thanks for sharing that and answering that. And if anyone had specific questions for you, like what's the best way that they can reach out to you for any of those further questions?
Honestly, LinkedIn is going to be the best way to reach out to me. And I'm going to apologize up front because I've been getting a ton of inquiries and my time is limited. And I'm trying my best. If it's, a situation where a one-on-one conversation I think would be really beneficial for you, I will absolutely try and squeeze you in. But if a lot of people are asking the same questions, what I'm trying to do is gear sets of LinkedIn posts towards answering those questions in a more general way. And then again, like Tony just said, you really have to just do your research. I can't sit down. No informaticist is going to be able to sit down and tell you you're missing this and then you'll be a perfect candidate. And for that same reason, because these roles are all different, please, please, please don't get discouraged if you're not finding a role, if you're interviewing and it's not going right, because again, these roles are all different and what they're looking for in these roles is different. So be true to yourself, keep exploring, keep being creative, and keep trying, and that position will happen. And if you do the preparation, like I said, it may come where you're not expecting it, but it'll come.
Awesome. Thanks. So I'll be putting a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes, but to be respectful of your time, thank you so much again, for just taking some time to be on this podcast, sharing about your journey and just in general, like just sharing everything about pharmacy informatics and how everything, different traits of what a good pharmacy informatics is and, some of your advice. So thank you so much.
Thank you again, Tony, for the opportunity. And hopefully, like what I miss most about being a retail pharmacist is being able to precept and mentor. And it's really hard to do that in informatics, especially from a remote role. So hopefully that this helps someone, helps encourage them or helps them see a perspective that they didn't see and encourages them to stick with it and get into the profession.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast. If you did, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere you're listening to this podcast. It really helps us reach more people who might be interested in learning more about pharmacy, informatics, and technology. If you would like to suggest a topic or somebody to be on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me on social media. I can be best reached on LinkedIn. Until next time, remember, technology is the tool, patient care is the goal.